In the dead of the Atlantic, a German U-boat did something no one could have predicted. It surrendered itself. For weeks, it had haunted Allied convoys, a shadow beneath the waves, yet it now surfaced voluntarily, its crew offering themselves to the enemy. Inside, cryptic logs and hidden compartments hinted at secrets that could rewrite the story of the Battle of the Atlantic. What drove these men to abandon orders, defy doctrine, and reveal themselves in the heart of enemy waters? The Atlantic Ocean in 1943 was a theater of unseen terror. Beneath the waves, shadows moved with deadly purpose, shapes of steel that could vanish without a trace, only to strike when least expected. These were the U-boats of the German Kriegsmarine, feared across Allied navies as instruments of precision and dread. Merchant convoys that crossed the vast storm-lashed waters were easy prey, their sailors constantly watching the horizon for the slightest disturbance. Above water, the waves might shimmer in silver moonlight, but below, the steel hulls of submarines lurked, poised for annihilation. Among the many German submarines prowling the Atlantic, there was one that would become infamous not for its victories, but for a mystery that still echoes in naval history. This was a U-boat that, against all expectation, surrendered itself. But the circumstances surrounding its surrender were as enigmatic as the ocean depths themselves. The Battle of the Atlantic had raged for years. German U-boats, operating in deadly wolf packs, coordinated attacks on convoys transporting vital supplies from North America to Britain. The Allies developed new tactics and technology: convoy escorts, sonar, and code breaking to counter the menace. Every encounter was a game of cat and mouse, a deadly dance that often ended in fire, smoke, and sinking steel. Yet for every U-boat lost to depth charges, there remained an element of unpredictability: the human factor. Crew members were isolated for weeks at a time, cut off from sunlight, confined to spaces barely wider than a coffin, with the constant thrum of diesel engines and the ever-present threat of death. Inside these submarines, life was both mechanical and unbearable. The diesel engines roared when surfaced. The electric motors whispered when submerged. Every turn of a valve, every sonar ping, could mean life or death. The captain, a man trained in strategy and survival, bore the crushing responsibility for his crew's fate. And in one small gray vessel, something was stirring, something that would defy the norms of naval warfare. This U-boat, a relatively standard Type 7 class, had completed several patrols without incident. Its crew was experienced, hardened by months of life underwater. Yet, in the months leading to its final mission, reports of strange events began filtering through German command: cryptic radio messages, mechanical anomalies, and an unusual hesitancy in patrol routes. To the outside world, these were minor irregularities, easily attributed to chance or bad weather. But for those who watched closely, they were the first whispers of a mystery that would ripple across the Atlantic. On a moonless night in mid-1943, the U-boat slipped through the waves, invisible and silent. Its target was a convoy of Allied freighters, lumbering across the open ocean. Periscopes rose like dark eyes, scanning for ships. Torpedo tubes were armed and ready. And yet, something was different. The crew felt it, though none could articulate it. The tension was electric, the kind that seeps into bones and keeps even the most seasoned sailor awake. What made this submarine remarkable was not the teeth of its weaponry, nor the stealth of its hull. It was the sense of a decision that was forming in the mind of its captain. A decision that, if acted upon, could alter the course of its own history and challenge the very code of warfare. It was a silent deliberation, invisible to the Allies, and mysterious even to the crew themselves. As the U-boat shadowed the convoy, a message was tapped out on the Enigma machine. But unlike the usual coded transmission of tactical commands, this was different, deliberate, clear, almost human. Somewhere, hundreds of miles away, Allied intelligence would receive signals that would puzzle even the most experienced cryptographers. Why would an enemy submarine broadcast its position voluntarily? Was it a trap? Or was something else at play? Above the waves, the convoy pressed forward, unaware of the strange ballet unfolding beneath them. Below, the U-boat moved with precision, yet carried an air of hesitation. The night deepened, and the ocean swallowed sound and light alike. And then, deep inside the vessel, something changed. A spark of uncertainty, a whisper of doubt, a movement that would set the stage for a decision so unthinkable that it would echo through history. The crew sensed it before they understood it. A choice was looming, one that would defy every expectation of what a U-boat could do. And, as the captain wrestled with the invisible forces of duty, survival, and conscience, the steel hull cut silently through the water, carrying a secret that no Allied ship could yet fathom. In the dead of night, the U-boat surfaced. For the first time, it would reveal itself not as a hunter, but as something entirely unexpected. What drove a German submarine to surrender voluntarily in the heart of the Atlantic? And as the ocean swallowed their question, the answer remained hidden beneath the waves. Beneath the steel hull of a U-boat, the ocean becomes a world of its own, a suffocating, humming, metallic universe, where every sound is amplified and every shadow could spell death. For the men aboard, life was a blend of routine and terror, mechanical precision and human vulnerability. In this confined space, there was no room for error. The diesel engines roared above water. The electric motors whispered below. Every torpedo, every depth charge, every periscope scan was a dance with destiny. The crew of the U-boat that would surrender knew this better than most. Months at sea had taught them that fear was not always immediate. Sometimes it was slow, like water seeping into a ship's hold. Days blurred into nights, nights into days, and all the while the Atlantic pressed against the hull with infinite patience. The smell of diesel, salt, and unwashed bodies became as constant as the pressure pushing against the steel. They slept in shifts, 4 men crammed into bunks that barely allowed them to lie flat. There was no privacy, there was no escape, only the unending hum of machinery and the distant, invisible threat of Allied depth charges. Life underwater was a psychological test as much as a physical one. Sailors developed routines to cope, card games on the mess table, whispered conversations, and letters they never sent. The commander's role was both tactical and paternal. He dictated every movement, every decision, every risk. And yet, even he could not control the invisible tension that gripped the crew, the unspoken dread that each dive, each patrol, could be their last. But in the weeks leading up to their final patrol, subtle anomalies began to disturb the equilibrium. Instruments malfunctioned at odd intervals, sometimes without explanation. Radio transmissions, usually precise and coded, carried strange sequences that puzzled even the seasoned radio operator. There were minor accidents in the engine room, equipment behaving as if it had a will of its own. The men whispered in corners, casting furtive glances at one another, unsure whether it was fatigue, superstition, or something far more deliberate. The submarine moved through the cold Atlantic like a predator, yet there was an unusual hesitancy. Orders that once were absolute were now questioned in the mind of the commander. Torpedoes were loaded, only to remain unused. The U-boat shadowed Allied convoys with precision, yet always maintained a strange distance, as if the crew feared crossing an invisible line. What was happening inside this vessel was more than mechanical, it was psychological, a tension that no depth gauge or compass could measure. For the men aboard, the atmosphere was electric, yet subtle. They were aware of a change, but not its nature. Small gestures, like a pause before sending a signal, or a glance exchanged between officers, carried weight far beyond what they knew. It was as if the submarine itself was aware, an extension of the crew's collective conscience, steering them toward a destiny none had ever imagined. Every U-boat carried orders from command, yet these were sometimes overridden by the human element. A commander could choose to follow, to disobey, or to reinterpret orders. And in this particular U-boat, that human element was in turmoil. For months, the crew had executed missions with cold precision, yet now, an invisible current pulled them toward a course of action that defied every expectation. The Atlantic is merciless. Even in the quiet moments, when the waves ripple against the hull and the moonlight glimmers faintly above, the submarine is never truly at peace. Depth charges could explode without warning. Aircraft could appear from the horizon, and sonar could locate them in an instant. Yet it was not the threat of death that consumed the crew. It was the strange, creeping realization that they might not be following orders for survival alone. Something else was guiding them, something unseen. As the submarine cruised beneath the waves, the crew's unease deepened. Radio messages intercepted by Allied intelligence were beginning to hint at this odd behavior. Encoded sequences, unlike any standard tactical transmission, suggested deliberation. Signals were being sent, yet their purpose was unclear: an invitation, a warning, or something entirely different. In naval intelligence offices thousands of miles away, cryptographers furrowed their brows. These messages did not match any known pattern, and that alone made them dangerous. And on board, the tension reached a silent crescendo. The commander's gaze lingered longer than usual on the horizon, though he could see nothing. Decisions were made, then unmade. Torpedoes were readied, then stowed again. The men exchanged nervous glances, each aware that the crew was standing on the precipice of something unprecedented. A decision was forming, one that would forever change the rules of engagement in the Atlantic theater. It was during one of these long, tense nights that the first deliberate choice was made, a decision that would defy logic, military protocol, and every unwritten rule of war at sea. The submarine, a machine of destruction designed to hunt and kill, was about to do the unthinkable. The crew sensed it before they understood it. And as the Atlantic waves whispered against the hull, a question hung in the cold metallic air. Could a hunter choose to surrender voluntarily, without provocation, in the heart of enemy waters? Just as dawn began to break over the horizon, a decision was made. A single, deliberate action would signal to the Allies that the U-boat had chosen a path no other German submarine had ever dared. What message was about to be sent across the Atlantic? And what would it mean for the men aboard, caught between loyalty, fear, and an unexplainable impulse to surrender? A faint glow of radar screens and the crackle of radio static filled Allied command centers as reports of an unusual transmission reached their ears. Naval intelligence officers leaned closer, scrutinizing the intercepted signals with disbelief. U-boats did not broadcast their positions voluntarily. U-boats did not send messages that seemed deliberate, almost human in intent, and yet the evidence was unmistakable. Somewhere in the vast Atlantic, a German submarine was sending signals that would baffle both commanders and cryptographers alike. The pattern of transmission was unlike any the Allies had seen. Encrypted messages carried unusual sequences, departing from the rigid tactical coding that had dominated Kriegsmarine communications for years. Analysts debated feverishly, was this a trap meant to lure Allied ships into a deadly ambush? Or was it something far stranger, an invitation, a plea, or a declaration that the crew themselves could not articulate in words? The implications were unsettling. If genuine, this signal could redefine expectations of enemy behavior in naval warfare. On board the submarine, tension was taut. The crew moved like ghosts through the narrow corridors, their every motion dictated by nerves, training, and a growing awareness that their actions were unprecedented. The commander sat before the Enigma machine, tapping out sequences with painstaking precision. Unlike previous missions, this was not routine communication. It was a deliberate choice, a calculated engagement with an enemy they had been taught to avoid at all costs. In the control room, officers exchanged furtive glances. There was no joy, no victory in the atmosphere, only the sharp edge of uncertainty. Months of patrols had trained them to react instinctively to threats, yet now their instincts were conflicted. They were sending messages that could be interpreted as surrender, but the reasoning behind it remained hidden, even from themselves. Every sound of the hull creaking, every whisper from the engine room, seemed amplified by the tension that gripped the crew. Far above, Allied ships adjusted their courses, sonar sweeping the dark waters. Officers debated action, approach cautiously, ready for combat, or wait and observe. Every decision carried risk. A miscalculation could result in the destruction of the submarine or the ships themselves. The Atlantic had long been a realm of hidden dangers, but this moment was unprecedented. For the first time, a U-boat was exposing itself voluntarily, its intent inscrutable. The signals continued, each one deliberate, each one raising more questions than answers. Cryptographers strained to decipher hidden meanings, but the messages resisted easy interpretation. Was the crew testing the waters of conscience, trying to communicate a moral decision? Or were they driven by something even stranger, fear, disillusionment, or secret orders from a command that defied conventional understanding? Every theory was as unsettling as it was improbable. As twilight approached, the U-boat surfaced. The crew's movements were meticulous, almost ritualistic. On the bridge, the commander signaled their intention clearly: compliance, not aggression. The steel vessel had become something entirely new, a hunter that had paused, chosen restraint, and exposed itself to the enemy. Allied sailors approached cautiously, unsure how to respond to this anomaly. Guns were trained, ready, but the submarine made no aggressive move. It was as though the ocean itself were holding its breath. Inside the submarine, a heavy silence had settled. The crew, trained to fight or die, now faced the unknown consequences of surrender. They had defied doctrine, broken routine, and perhaps even disobeyed orders, but there was no turning back. The decision had been made, and every man aboard understood that the outcome would shape not only their fates, but also the perception of naval warfare itself. As the first Allied ship neared, the U-boat's deck shimmered in the fading light. A signal flashed across the water, deliberate and unmistakable. The crew held their breath, knowing the moment could determine life or death. But what they had sent was more than a message. It was a mystery that would leave the Atlantic and history itself questioning. Why would a German submarine surrender voluntarily in the heart of enemy waters? The horizon stretched endlessly, a pale gray smear against the trembling waves, as the U-boat crested the surface for the first time in weeks. Silence hung over the Atlantic like a shroud, broken only by the creak of metal and the distant hum of Allied engines. The crew felt it immediately, a mixture of relief and terror. For the first time, they were exposed to the eyes of the enemy, yet their actions were deliberate, controlled, and entirely unprecedented. Allied sailors aboard the convoy's escort ships were equally astonished. Reports had reached command about strange transmissions, but nothing had prepared them for a U-boat to appear openly on the surface without firing a single shot. Officers exchanged hurried glances, weighing the danger. A U-boat that surrendered voluntarily was a concept that seemed impossible, a deviation from the rules of engagement that had governed the Atlantic for years. The German crew moved with cautious precision, every hatch opened slowly, every footstep deliberate. The commander, standing at the conning tower, signaled compliance and non-aggression, his eyes scanning the approaching ships. He knew that a single misstep could trigger a barrage of gunfire and depth charges. The men had trained for combat, not surrender, and the psychological strain was palpable. Their hearts pounded in rhythm with the waves, every sound magnified in the hollow silence of the open ocean. Boarding parties prepared in tense anticipation. Life rafts and small motor launches approached, carrying sailors who had been trained to fight, not negotiate. Yet even as the Allied crew readied themselves, they could sense something extraordinary was unfolding. The U-boat, though a weapon of destruction, now carried the air of a supplicant, a vessel offering itself without coercion. Questions raced through every officer's mind. Why had the crew chosen this course? Was this a ruse, a trap, or an act of conscience? As the first Allied sailors clambered aboard, the interior of the U-boat revealed the human cost of life beneath the waves. Bunks were narrow, barely wide enough to stretch a single limb. The smell of diesel, sweat, and salt filled the air. Torpedoes lined the racks, their deadly potential momentarily irrelevant. Charts and logs lay scattered, but most of the crew's personal effects had been stowed meticulously, a hint at the pride and discipline that still governed the men, even in surrender. Interrogations began immediately, cautious and deliberate. The commander spoke with a measured tone, explaining the decision without revealing unnecessary detail. The Allied officers listened intently, noting both the obedience and the hesitancy in his answers. Something had driven these men to abandon their mission and seek surrender voluntarily, but the reason remained elusive, obscured by the fog of war and the disciplined secrecy of the Kriegsmarine. Every document and log recovered from the submarine carried subtle hints, references to morale, operational difficulties, and cryptic annotations that hinted at internal conflicts. Historians would later debate these entries endlessly, interpreting them as evidence of ideological disillusionment, fear of destruction, or perhaps covert instructions from higher command. What was certain was that this surrender was not merely a tactical choice, it was an event that challenged the assumptions of naval warfare. Yet even amid this careful scrutiny, one anomaly stood out. A single log entry, partially damaged and written in hurried script, hinted at a secret mission that extended beyond the ordinary convoy attacks. It suggested the U-boat had carried more than torpedoes and crew. It carried information, possibly intelligence, whose significance would only become clear later. Allied officers recognized its potential, but before they could investigate fully, the entry disappeared from circulation, leaving only fragments and rumors behind. As night fell over the Atlantic, the surrendered U-boat lay still, a steel ghost tethered to the convoy it had once hunted. Allied ships maintained a cautious perimeter, aware that the ocean could conceal surprises even in surrender. The German crew retreated below decks, exhausted, fearful, and yet strangely liberated. They had survived the impossible, but the true implications of their actions remained uncertain. In the quiet of the U-boat's interior, one officer discovered a hidden compartment, its contents obscured by time and secrecy. What was inside hinted at a mission so sensitive that it could change the understanding of the entire Atlantic campaign. And as whispers of its purpose spread through Allied command, a chilling realization took hold. The surrender was only the beginning of a story that would continue to haunt historians and veterans alike. The interior of the surrendered U-boat felt like a tomb of secrets, the kind that only the ocean could guard for decades. Allied sailors, having carefully boarded, moved cautiously through the narrow corridors, their boots echoing softly against steel floors slick with condensation. Every hatch, every compartment held a potential revelation. The submarine was designed for efficiency, for killing and evasion, but now it held a different kind of weight, the weight of unanswered questions. Documents, charts, and logbooks were the first things seized. Officers pored over them, hoping for clarity, but instead found fragments, annotations in hurried German script, and cryptic remarks that seemed to hint at missions beyond standard convoy attacks. A single partially damaged page caught particular attention, references to codes, drop zones, and a series of coordinates that did not match any known Allied or Axis naval route. End quote. Could the submarine have been carrying intelligence of unprecedented importance? The crew, still confined below decks, remained calm but wary. They answered questions with precision, yet avoided details that could compromise classified operations. It was clear that surrender was not an act of cowardice. Something more complex was at play, a blend of morality, strategy, and perhaps desperation. For the first time, the Allies saw not a machine of war, but a vessel caught in the tension between orders and conscience, between duty and survival. As Allied officers examined the compartments, they discovered items that seemed ordinary at first: crates of supplies, navigational equipment, and spare torpedoes. But hidden among them were subtle anomalies: a small locked safe, maps marked with unfamiliar symbols, and a set of ciphers that resisted immediate decoding. Every discovery hinted at a mission deeper than any standard patrol. Something about this U-boat suggested it carried secrets that could shift the understanding of the Battle of the Atlantic itself. The logs provided tantalizing clues. One entry, written in coded shorthand, hinted at an internal conflict aboard the vessel. Officers debated whether it referred to dissent within the crew, technical malfunctions, or a larger covert objective. Some historians would later theorize that the submarine might have been carrying sensitive intelligence meant to be delivered under impossible circumstances. A mission so secret that the very act of surrender could have been preordained by SS. Higher orders. Even the physical layout of the U-boat raised questions. Certain compartments had been sealed or reinforced beyond typical specifications. The Allies wondered why these areas had been off-limits, even to the crew at times. Could it have been a storage space for highly sensitive documents, or even experimental technology? Every plausible explanation seemed insufficient, leaving the submarine shrouded in a sense of mystery that would linger for decades. As investigators continued to examine the vessel, a troubling realization emerged. Some documents were missing. Pages from logbooks, sections of navigational charts, and even entire cipher sheets had vanished before they could be analyzed. The disappearance was inexplicable, leading to speculation about sabotage, hurried removal by the crew, or hidden caches that had never been discovered. It was as if the U-boat had been designed not only to navigate the Atlantic, but also to conceal a story meant to remain partially untold. The crew's demeanor suggested knowledge beyond what they revealed. Subtle glances, measured pauses, and evasive answers hinted at awareness of secrets too sensitive to disclose. The surrender had spared them physically, but the psychological weight of what they carried remained. Allied officers could sense that these men were custodians of information that could alter the course of history, yet the exact nature of that information remained tantalizingly out of reach. Some theories emerged almost immediately. Perhaps the U-boat had been involved in espionage, carrying documents or codes critical to Nazi operations. Perhaps it had been ordered to surrender under specific circumstances to protect a greater strategic secret. Or perhaps the crew had acted on their own, motivated by conscience or the desire to preserve knowledge and lives that would otherwise be lost in the Atlantic depths. Every theory was compelling, and every theory left critical questions unanswered. As night fell over the stationary U-boat, the Atlantic whispered against its steel hull, concealing the depths below and the secrets still aboard. Allied officers, tired but alert, continued their meticulous search, aware that every detail, no matter how small, might unlock the truth. Yet the ocean, as always, held its silence, keeping some answers submerged in mystery. In a dark corner of the submarine, a small, locked compartment resisted all attempts at opening. Its contents remained hidden, a final enigma aboard a vessel that had already defied expectations. What could be inside a secret so sensitive it could shift the understanding of the war? And as historians and naval officers would later discover, some secrets were never meant to surface, but the U-boat had chosen to surrender anyway. The surrendered U-boat, now secured and moored under Allied supervision, became an object of fascination and speculation. It had defied every expectation of what a German submarine could or would do. Officers, cryptographers, and historians alike would pore over its logs, compartments, and cryptic transmissions for decades to come. Yet even as answers emerged, the story refused to settle into neat historical lines. Some questions were answered, but others remained submerged, like the vessel itself, lurking beneath the waves. The crew's fate followed a mixture of procedural routine and cautious respect. Interrogations were carried out to uncover operational orders, mission objectives, and intelligence that could benefit the Allies. Surprisingly, the men were treated with a level of careful scrutiny rather than harsh hostility. Their surrender had been unprecedented. They were not merely prisoners, they were witnesses to something extraordinary. Their testimonies revealed glimpses of what had driven the decision: fear, conscience, operational anomalies, and possibly secret instructions from high command. Yet much remained unsaid, either intentionally or because some knowledge could not be fully articulated. Allied officers cataloged the contents of the submarine, yet gaps persisted. Documents, cipher sheets, and cryptic log entries had disappeared, removed perhaps by the crew before surrender, or hidden in compartments yet undiscovered. Analysts debated endlessly whether these missing elements contained strategic intelligence, warnings, or directives that could have altered the trajectory of the Battle of the Atlantic. Some speculated that the U-boat had carried more than crew and cargo, possibly secret communications, maps of coastal defenses, or even technology too sensitive to survive exposure. Historians examining the incident in later years were struck by the human dimension. The surrender was not a military failure, it was a moral and psychological act. The men aboard had chosen, against every instinct and directive, to step out of the shadows of the Atlantic and confront the enemy with a gesture of surrender. Their motivations would remain the subject of debate: fear, disillusionment, conscience, or covert orders from a higher authority that sought to protect secrets from falling into the wrong hands. Each explanation held plausibility, yet none fully captured the enigma. Artifacts from the U-boat eventually made their way into museums, libraries, and naval archives. The vessel itself was studied for lessons in submarine design, tactical innovation, and psychological endurance. But certain corners of the story resisted illumination. A locked compartment, discovered too late or never opened, remained a haunting mystery. Some officers claimed it contained files critical to intelligence operations. Others believed it might hold personal effects or evidence of clandestine missions. Whatever the truth, the compartment stood as a symbol of the ocean's enduring secrecy. The U-boat's surrender had immediate strategic effects. Allied commanders gained insights into German submarine design, operational patterns, and crew psychology. Yet the broader psychological impact on both sides of the Atlantic was profound. The notion that a U-boat could surrender voluntarily challenged assumptions about the enemy's resolve and humanity. It reminded the Allies that even in the machinery of war, the human element could not be discounted. Conscience, fear, and decision-making under pressure could alter outcomes in ways no strategist could fully predict. Decades later, veterans and historians would revisit the story, piecing together fragments from logs, testimonies, and physical evidence. Every revelation brought new questions. Why had the U-boat chosen surrender at that precise moment? What exactly had been lost in the missing documents? Could this act have been a calculated measure to protect lives or knowledge, rather than an impulsive choice? Even with advanced research and recovered artifacts, the Atlantic kept its secrets, holding portions of the story beneath waves that had witnessed both destruction and mercy. The surrendered U-boat had become more than a military curiosity. It had become a legend, a testament to the unpredictability of war and the enduring mystery of human choice under extreme conditions. It reminded all who studied it that history is never entirely complete. Even in the age of technology, code breaking, and intelligence networks, the actions of a few individuals in a steel tube beneath the ocean could leave echoes that ripple across decades. Somewhere in an Allied archive, a single page from the U-boat's logbook remains unaccounted for. Historians speculate about its contents: a directive, a secret mission, or an insight so sensitive it could reshape understanding of the Atlantic campaigns. The page may have been lost, stolen, or deliberately hidden, but its absence ensures that the story of the U-boat that surrendered itself will never be entirely solved. Even today, the Atlantic holds its silence, leaving history to wonder, what did the submarine really carry beneath the waves?